There are times when we make history, and there are times when history makes us.
So what is it like to be that mysteriously missing cabinet member?
We welcome you as we gather.
Each year, their strategic absence from the State of the Union is announced on air.
This year, it is Anthony Fox.
Secretary of Interior Ken Salazar. And that is HUD Secretary Sean Donovan.
And, of course, 1997, tonight's designated survivor was you.
That's correct.
Dan Glickman. He is neither a name nor a face you would easily recognize. Just ask this child, given the task of introducing him at an event.
Secretary of Mr. Dan Glickman.
And yet, had things gone horribly wrong on the evening of February 4th, 1997, today we might be teaching school kids about the fortitude and wisdom of President Glickman.
The Secret Service called and said they wanted to come over and talk to me.
It was the start of Bill Clinton's second term, his first State of the Union since re-election.
The President of the United States.
In that more relaxed, bygone era before the September 11th attacks.
This year it is the Agriculture Secretary Dan Glickman.
I got the feeling they went with the very important departments, like the Agriculture Department. and
You're being facetious, but were you a tad insulted?
No, because I figured that it would be a nice thing to put on my resume, and God forbid if it were to happen, you know, I mean, I'd have to call my mother and father and says, your son's the president. So I didn't have a lot of preparation for it. I had very little background as to what would happen.
They didn't give you briefing books? They didn't
No.
give you a national security briefing?
No.
Let you know?
Glickman was allowed to choose any destination outside of Washington, D.C., so he picked his daughter's Manhattan apartment, where he traveled in unfamiliar presidential style, with a security detail and even a small motorcade.
I flew up on Air Force airplanes, and there was a policy person and the military person, I presume, with the nuclear code, and a physician.
And all these people sat with you at your daughter's apartment?
Well, they stayed downstairs.
Right.
I went up to her apartment, and we watched President Clinton.
My fellow Americans, the state of our union is strong.
Were you nervous? Were you tense?
Not particularly. I think that I felt like it's going to be okay. Nobody's going to do anything.
Of course, that nonchalance vanished forever on September 11th.
Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack.
The military is responding by putting its forces around the world on the highest state of alert.
The government did not know if more attacks were coming and where. Gale Norton, George W. Bush's Secretary of the Interior, was one of a handful of high-ranking officials sent to secret locations.
We went to a secure, undisclosed location.
I know you can't tell me exactly where you were, but can you sort of describe what the conditions were?
The shampoo had curdled, the deodorant smelled bad because it was all so old.
It was clear when you got there that it hadn't been used in a while.
It had not been used.
4 months later, she was pressed into duty as the first State of the Union designated survivor after 9/11.
As we gather tonight, our nation is at war, our economy is in recession, and the civilized world faces unprecedented dangers.
Because we had seen what happened with 9/11, it was much more a real concern than it had ever been before.
People took it more seriously.
There's always that nagging doubt in the back of your mind saying, but gosh, maybe something could happen.
Norton even prepared her possible speech to the American people.
I didn't write anything on paper, but I certainly thought about it.
At least along with the stress, apparently there are some perks. According to 2004 designated staffer Alex Vogel, yes, there are staffers in those bunkers too. It was the top-notch cuisine.
I was pleasantly surprised that we were very well fed. I think we had steak and lobster and red wine, which was great. They didn't want us to go hungry in the event of an apocalypse, which was somewhat reassuring.
But that said, Andrew Card, Chief of Staff for President Bush, says cabinet members weren't exactly clamoring for the job of designated survivor. preferring the airtime and access at the State of the Union.
We had people here as early as 8:15 this morning staking out seats on the aisle.
There were funny stories about, no, please don't pick me. It's not my turn. Can somebody else do it?
Did your daughter, I mean, she obviously knew you were the designated survivor. Was she aware of?
She called every one of her friends.
She did?
Yeah, I told her.
As for developing an agenda for a sudden presidency, fortunately, none of the designated survivors thus far have had to worry much about that. In fact, Dan Glickman spent more time that night worrying how to get home.
I remember one of the agents called me. They said, Mr. Glickman, the mission is terminated. And I said, well, why don't you all go home because I'll take my daughter to dinner. And we get out of the restaurant and there's a giant sleet storm and we couldn't get a cab.
For an instant, the hand of history had raised him from relative anonymity to the cusp of greatness, and then gently but firmly put him back down.
We waited and waited and waited, and we walked 10 blocks in the rain and the sleet back to her apartment. And 3 hours before, I was probably the most powerful man on the face of the earth, and I couldn't even get a cab. It's a great story about life, to be honest with you. You can fall just as fast as you go up.